Perhaps you'd be more comfortable at a clinic that appreciates creative interpretations of medical protocol, Ms. Cooper. That is what Dr. Caldwell said 14 hours before the Pentagon called Cedar Creek Medical. The fluorescent lights hum over the ICU hallway where Ashley Cooper refills medication carts with methodical precision, her movements economical in a way that doesn't match her 6-month employment record. The antiseptic smell mingles with floor wax as she passes the room holding the unconscious Navy SEAL, Commander Rains. The patient charts say, medevaced from Baghdad 3 days ago with unexplained cardiac complications. Ashley's hands never shake as she checks his vitals, though she pauses at the bedside longer than protocol requires. His breathing is shallow. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm, and she counts the breaths without moving her lips. 16 per minute. 2 below normal. She reaches for his chart and notes the discrepancy Caldwell has overlooked, or chosen to ignore. Her fingers move across the clipboard with the steady precision of someone who has documented casualties on the other side of the world, someone who has held lives together when the floor beneath her was concrete and the ceiling was open sky. In her locker downstairs, hidden beneath her street clothes and a towel she doesn't use, sits a pair of worn combat boots with Baghdad dust still in the treads. The leather is cracked across the right toe from a ricochet she never reported. The laces are threaded with paracord stripped from an Osprey cargo net. Those boots have walked 11 miles through enemy territory with a Navy SEAL's arm around her shoulders, his left lung collapsing with each step, and she had carried half his weight without slowing down. The physical therapist wouldn't know that. The cardiologist wouldn't know that. The residents trailing behind Dr. Caldwell down the ICU corridor certainly wouldn't know that, and that was precisely the point. A faint scar runs along her right forearm, visible when she reaches for supplies, thin and white, the kind that only forms when a wound closes without infection because someone knew exactly how to keep a field dressing sterile under fire. She'd covered it with makeup until the 3rd week of her nursing contract, then stopped bothering. Most people saw what they expected to see, a new nurse with steady hands and a quiet demeanor, the type who didn't ask questions and showed up early for shifts. No one looked deeper. No one asked where the scar came from or why her hands never trembled when she handled critical patients or why she moved through a code with the calm precision of someone who had already survived the worst thing she could imagine. Dr. Marcus Caldwell arrives for evening rounds with 4 residents trailing behind him like remoras following a shark, their white coats pristine and their notepads ready to capture his wisdom. He is tall in the way that surgeons cultivate, the kind of height that comes from standing while others sit, commanding while others listen. His voice carries the particular tone surgeons use when they've decided someone doesn't belong, a frequency calibrated to make the listener question their own competence. He stops at Ashley's station, picks up her charting, and the air pressure changes. His jaw tightens as he reads her notes about Commander Rains. This patient's cardiac function is stable, Caldwell says, not looking up from the chart. His voice is loud enough for the residents to hear. Loud enough for everyone within 20 feet to understand that a correction is being delivered. His ejection fraction came back at 47% yesterday. That's within acceptable parameters for post-operative recovery. Ashley doesn't look up from the medication cart. She reaches for a vial of metoprolol and begins drawing the measured dose with a 25-gauge needle, her movements economical and precise. Ejection fraction alone doesn't account for the decrease in urine output or the rising troponin levels from this morning's labs. The residents shift. One of them writes something down. Caldwell's face flushes a single shade deeper, that particular crimson that comes from being contradicted by someone who isn't supposed to speak during rounds. The troponin is residual damage from the initial insult in Baghdad, Caldwell says. His tone has sharpened now, edged with the kind of condescension reserved for subordinates who don't know their place. It will resolve as the cardiac muscle heals. What we don't do is panic at every fluctuation in lab values. That's the difference between nursing intuition and medical training, Ms. Cooper. Ashley's hands continue their work. Draw. Capital label. Set. The movements don't change. Her jaw clenches once, barely perceptible, a single involuntary muscular contraction that takes less than a second to resolve. By the time Caldwell looks at her face, she has already smoothed everything away. Her expression is neutral, the kind of blank that only comes from years of practice concealing rage. "Yes, doctor," she says. Her voice is quiet, respectful. The voice of a nurse who has learned to swallow her own observations and defer to the credentials on the wall. This is the mask she wears, the careful construction of deference that has allowed her to move through 6 months of Cedar Creek Medical's corridors without drawing attention beyond professional admiration for her clinical competence. Caldwell sets her chart down on the counter with enough force that the clipboard clatters against the stainless steel surface. The sound echoes down the hallway like a judge's gavel. He turns to his residents, and his voice takes on a didactic tone, the cadence of a teacher explaining a concept to eager students who have never questioned his authority. What Ms. Cooper doesn't yet understand is that nursing is about following orders from the physicians who have the training to make clinical judgments. It's about documentation, vital signs, and recognizing when a patient is developing complications. He pauses. He allows the residents to absorb this hierarchy, this ordering of the world in which doctors think and nurses execute. Not about second-guessing the care plan based on intuition. Ashley's fingers are steady as she places the medication vial back in the cart. Steady as a surgical laser. The trembling isn't fear. It's restraint. The residents follow Caldwell to the next room, their footsteps creating a percussion line down the hallway, boot leather on tile. Confident and unified, the sound of institutional power moving through space. Ashley waits until they round the corner toward the staff lounge, and then she pulls up Commander Raines's latest lab results on the computer terminal in his room. Ejection fraction 47%. But the troponin isn't stable, it's climbing. 0.83 yesterday. 0.96 this morning. The trend line is pointing upward, and that means his cardiac tissue is being damaged faster than it's healing, which means the complication isn't post-operative recovery. It's acute cardiac stress, possibly early tamponade, and if Caldwell doesn't see it, then Ashley will have to. She reviews the commander's imaging from 48 hours ago, a small pericardial effusion noted but not clinically significant, the radiologist had written. Not clinically significant. Ashley knows what that phrase means in the language of defensive medicine. It means someone in radiology didn't want to alarm the attending, didn't want to be the bearer of bad news, and now the patient was drifting toward a complication that Caldwell's pride wouldn't allow him to see. Her phone vibrates in her scrub pocket. A text from an unknown number with a Washington, D.C. area code, status check. How is he? No signature. No name. Just the kind of secure communication protocol that the Pentagon uses when it doesn't want civilian phone records showing a connection to operational intelligence. She doesn't respond. She doesn't carry classified conversations in unencrypted text messages. But the message reminds her of why she's here, underneath the scrubs, operating under a civilian employment record that would not survive scrutiny. Master Chief Petty Officer Ashley Cooper is officially on medical leave from a Joint Special Operations Command assignment monitoring terrorism threats in the CENTCOM area of operations. In reality, she is undercover as a nurse at Cedar Creek Medical in Savannah because 3 weeks ago, Commander Raines and his SEAL Team 3 strike force had encountered something in Baghdad, intelligence that required protection, a patient that required observation, and a handler who could move undetected inside the hospital walls. She closes the lab portal and returns to the hallway, where the evening shift is beginning its changeover. Around her, the hospital moves through its ordained rhythms, monitors beeping in established patterns, ventilators wheeze their mechanical breath, nurses call out report items to their replacements. The ordinary machinery of saving lives operates exactly as it has operated for decades, and no one in this hallway knows that the equipment, the protocols, the very architecture of Cedar Creek Medical is being used as a forward operating base for something classified. That evening, after Caldwell has gone home to his house in the historic district and the night shift has taken over the ICU, Ashley changes out of her scrubs in the locker room. The fluorescent lights flicker once, casting the row of lockers into momentary darkness. She opens hers and moves her towel aside. The combat boots are still there, mud-caked and weathered, the kind of footwear that doesn't belong in a hospital locker room. She touches the cracked leather across the right toe, and the muscle memory returns with the tactile sensation, the moment of impact, the ricochet that meant someone was shooting at her position, the way Commander Raines's full weight had shifted onto her left shoulder as his lung began to collapse. She had carried him anyway. 11 miles through terrain that wanted to kill them both, with nothing but a field dressing, her own will, and the certain knowledge that stopping meant death for both of them. Pain is data. Pain is information that the body is still functional, still fighting, still capable of movement. She had translated his agony into forward motion, had converted his consciousness into steps counted in her own mind, and when they'd reached the extraction point, she had released him to the waiting medics and disappeared back into the darkness because that's what operators do, they complete the mission and vanish before anyone can ask questions about authorization or chain of command. Now she stood in a hospital locker room, holding the physical evidence of that identity, and above her a Navy SEAL lay in an ICU bed being managed by a surgeon who couldn't see the complications developing in his own patient's heart because pride was a more powerful diagnostic tool than clinical acumen. She places the boots back under the towel, covers them, and closes the locker. Her reflection in the metal surface is distorted and fractured, someone between two versions of herself, existing in the space where civilian identity and military training occupied the same body. The woman looking back at her has steady eyes and a jaw that knows how to remain silent under pressure. She is someone who has learned to disappear inside an acceptable performance of normalcy. But that wasn't the last time Dr. Caldwell would underestimate her. She clocks out at 2300 hours and drives through the rain-soaked streets of Savannah toward the small apartment she rents on the south side, the kind of place that leaves no impression, generates no gossip, exists entirely in the margins of civilian life. The parking lot is empty except for her vehicle. She sits in the driver's seat with the engine off and the rain drumming against the windshield, and she pulls up Commander Raines's chart one more time on her personal encrypted tablet. The troponin levels. The ejection fraction. The pericardial effusion that wasn't significant enough to treat. These were the numbers that told the real story, the clinical narrative that existed beneath Caldwell's dismissal, and she knew from experience that narrative wouldn't resolve itself. It would escalate. It would become critical. It would become the kind of emergency that required someone to be ready. In 48 hours, the night shift would begin, and in the hours after midnight, when the hospital was at its quietest and the monitoring was at its most minimal, something was going to happen in Commander Raines's room that would require every skill she had ever learned and every authority she had ever possessed. She didn't know the exact timing. She didn't know the precise moment when his body would finally break under the stress Caldwell had dismissed. But she knew it was coming. She could read the trajectory of his decline the way someone trained in field medicine reads a deteriorating casualty, inevitably, inexorably, toward a point where the difference between survival and death was measured in minutes. And when that moment came, she would be ready. The Grand Rounds Amphitheater at Cedar Creek Medical smelled like antiseptic and hot projector bulbs. 30 residents sat in tiered seating, laptops and tablets balanced on their laps, the kind of audience that fed on case study dissections the way sharks fed on blood in the water. Ashley stood against the back wall, her badge clipped to her scrubs, her posture deliberately small, the posture of someone who belonged in the background. Dr. Caldwell owned the center stage the way a conductor owns an orchestra, his tailored white coat pristine, his movements fluid with the certainty of absolute institutional power. He clicked his laser pointer and Ashley's patient notes materialized on the projection screen behind him, enlarged to 30 feet wide. Her handwriting. Her assessments. Her orders requesting additional cardiac monitoring for the SEAL commander. Here, Caldwell said, the laser red dot circling her documentation like a targeting reticule, is what happens when nursing staff, particularly new nursing staff, decide that protocols are suggestions rather than requirements. He didn't use her name. He gestured to the back of the room, toward her, but spoke as if describing a theoretical problem, an abstraction, a cautionary tale rendered in clinical detachment. What we see here is unauthorized advocacy. Inappropriate direct communication with external parties. And most concerning, he paused, letting the residents lean forward, a concerning overfamiliarity with specialized military medical terminology. The residents' pens moved across paper. A woman in the third row glanced back, her eyes finding Ashley for a half second before looking away, as if she'd been caught witnessing something private and violent. The patient in question, Caldwell continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial tone that somehow carried perfectly through the amphitheater's acoustics, presented with an elevated cardiac enzyme panel that could be attributed to multiple etiologies. Yet our nursing colleague here insisted on additional monitoring protocols that were not indicated by clinical data. He clicked again. Another slide. Ashley's request for extended telemetry burned in white text against blue background. This is scope creep. This is the erosion of medical hierarchy. And this is precisely why we maintain clear protocols, not to stifle nursing judgment, but to preserve the structure that keeps this hospital functioning. The silence that followed had weight. Ashley could feel 30 pairs of eyes processing, analyzing, filing away the lesson. They were learning that challenging a doctor's orders, even quietly, even when you suspected harm was approaching like weather on the horizon, was not brave. It was insubordination. It was proof of dangerous thinking. Caldwell smiled. The smile of someone who had just successfully redefined a problem. Questions. One resident raised her hand. How would you counsel the nurse on appropriate escalation procedures? Excellent question, Caldwell said, and Ashley watched him field it like a politician fielding a softball, perfectly, with grace, citing hospital policy chapter and section. The problem wasn't him. The problem was her. The problem was the assumption that someone at her level, someone with a few years of nursing experience, could possibly understand the complexity of cardiac pathology better than a physician with 23 years of practice and a curriculum vitae that required 3 pages to list. The presentation lasted 40 minutes. By the end, Ashley was no longer a person in the room. She was a case study. A teaching moment. A warning. 2 hours later, during her double shift, she found herself alone at the third-floor vending machine, inserting coins for coffee at 1:19 p.m., her hands moving through the mechanical ritual while her eyes tracked the hallway. Caldwell materialized from around the corner as if he'd known her schedule better than she did. Perhaps he had. Perhaps this wasn't chance. Nurse Cooper, he said, his voice pitched for the residents passing behind him on their way to the teaching kitchen. I've been reviewing your employment history. Those gaps between positions, quite irregular. Makes one wonder what you were doing during those years. Ashley's hand paused inside the vending machine, holding the paper cup. Or perhaps, he continued, his tone softening into something more dangerous because of its softness, what you were running from. The machine's mechanical grinding filled the space as it dispensed her coffee. 1 second. 2. The sound of hydraulics and plastic had absolutely nothing to do with the man standing 4 feet behind her. I'm concerned about your stability as a staff member, Caldwell said. Your ability to follow directive. Your judgment. He paused, letting the implications hang in the air like surgical instruments before they're placed in a tray. Security could escort you out if you find our standards too restrictive. No harm. No foul. Just a difficult fit. Ashley removed the cup. The coffee was still dripping. She turned without acknowledgement, without even the courtesy of eye contact, and walked back toward the ICU as if he'd commented on the weather forecast. Behind her, she heard a resident ask Caldwell something about sepsis protocols, and Caldwell's answer came swift and authoritative, the incident already recontextualized, already filed away in the institutional memory as another example of his patience with problematic staff. She moved through the hallways with the measured gait of someone whose body had been trained to remain calm under observation. Her face showed nothing. Her breathing stayed level. Only her jaw clenched once, barely perceptible, a single muscular contraction that lasted less than a second, then released. The ICU bay held 7 beds. Commander Raines occupied the 3rd one, his chest rising and falling with mechanical assistance, his cardiac monitor tracing the mountains and valleys of a heart that was weakening in ways the standard diagnostics couldn't quite explain. Ashley checked his vitals, reviewed his medication drip, noted the telemetry readings. Everything normal. Everything wrong. It wasn't until 11 p.m., when the night shift had thinned to skeleton crew and the ICU held only the breathing sounds of machines and patients, that Ashley found herself alone in the supply closet restocking gauze, her hands moving through boxes with automatic precision. She pulled out her phone. The photo was 16 months old, Marcus in his dropped dress uniform, standing in front of Cedar Creek's main entrance, not yet understanding why his mother needed him to document this place. Behind him in the background, blurred but present, was a framed photograph visible through a window, Commander Rains receiving a commendation, Ashley's hand steady as she pinned the medal to his chest, both of them in dress uniforms, the moment captured and filed away in Cedar Creek's administrative office as a generic decoration. A connection no one here knew. Her hands finally trembled. Not from fear. From the precise understanding of what came next. From the mechanics of watching someone try to isolate a problem they didn't understand, using institutional weapons against a threat they couldn't see coming, because they didn't know who was standing in their hospital wearing scrubs instead of dress blues, running a counterintelligence operation instead of processing admissions. By morning, Caldwell had weaponized the institution with surgical precision. Ashley found the reprimand in her employee file during her lunch break, formal documentation, meticulously dated, copied to the hospital administrator and the nursing director. The language was clinical. Insubordination regarding established cardiac monitoring protocols. Boundary violations including unauthorized communication with patients' external associates. Deviation from scope of practice. Each phrase was technically accurate and strategically lethal, a paper trail designed to establish that the problem was her, had always been her, and would remain her unless she corrected or removed herself. The nursing supervisor, Patricia Gonzalez, requested Ashley in her office during shift change. Patricia wouldn't meet her eyes during the counseling session, a woman who'd worked at Cedar Creek for 14 years, who knew how power moved through the building like electrical current through copper wire. "I want to support you," Patricia said, which meant, "I can't support you. But I'm concerned about these reports. Dr. Caldwell has elevated this to administration." "Understood," Ashley said. "There's going to be a formal investigation," Patricia continued, her voice lower now, as if she could keep the words quiet enough that they wouldn't matter. "Into your credentials. Your background. She hesitated, searching for the right word, experience level. Ashley nodded. She understood the escalation pattern. Stage 1, public humiliation, institutional positioning, narrative control. Stage 2, formal documentation, administrative network activation, credential questioning. Stage 3, formal investigation, the machinery of institutional power focused on a single point, bearing down with the weight of bureaucracy. What Caldwell didn't understand was that the machinery he was activating would eventually require actual investigation, which would require actual review of actual facts, which would create actual paperwork that would eventually reach actual eyes that had clearance far beyond Cedar Creek Medical. He was preparing the ammunition for the shot that would destroy him. He just didn't know it yet. That evening, at home, Marcus found her staring at deployment photos she usually kept hidden, Fallujah 2006, Ramadi 2008, Baghdad 2011. Her in uniform. Her with a rifle sling across her chest. Her 16 years younger, eyes that had seen things the 16-year-old in a DROT uniform couldn't yet imagine. "Mom, you've been different since you started at Cedar Creek," Marcus said, his voice carrying that particular weight of military family awareness, the ability to distinguish between ordinary workplace stress and operational stress. "This isn't like the clinic jobs." "It's fine," she said. "Just workplace politics." "You don't get that look from workplace politics," he said. "Military kids learn to read their parents the way other kids learn to read books." "Something's wrong." She told him the rest was just administrative adjustment, nothing that required his involvement, nothing that mattered beyond the immediate shift schedule. She didn't tell him about Commander Rains. She didn't tell him about the Pentagon oversight. She didn't tell him that his school, his safety, his ordinary teenage existence in Savannah depended on her maintaining a cover identity at a hospital where the chief medical officer was slowly building a case against her while, unknowingly, destroying himself. That night, alone in her bedroom, Ashley accessed her personal laptop and pulled up Commander Rains's medical file using her staff credentials. She cross-referenced his cardiac enzyme patterns against known pharmaceutical toxicology profiles, running the numbers through her mind like someone reading a map written in blood chemistry and dose calculations. Elevated troponin. Depressed ejection fraction. Progressive myocardial dysfunction that presented like natural deterioration but moved with the precision of intentional harm. The pattern made her blood cold because it matched. It matched digitalis toxicity. It matched the slow accumulation of a substance that would kill a human being by making their own heart betray them, one beat at a time. Someone at Cedar Creek was trying to kill the Navy SEAL commander, and she was running out of time to prove it before Caldwell's administrative investigation became so consuming that she lost access to the ICU entirely. She was running out of time before the institutional weapons pointed at her succeeded in their purpose. She was running out of time, and the only thing stopping her from acting on what she suspected was her orders: observe, document, report through channels, maintain cover. Pain was data. Institutional humiliation was information. Every attack from Caldwell was a piece of the puzzle, proof of his willingness to weaponize the system, proof that someone inside Cedar Creek's administration was capable of murder disguised as medical complication. The question wasn't whether she could save Commander Raines. The question was whether the Pentagon would authorize the action before the hospital administrative machinery chewed up her cover completely. At 6:30 a.m., before the morning shift briefing even started, Dr. Caldwell sat in his office with the hospital phone pressed to his ear. The board president's voice crackled through, still rough with sleep. Caldwell's words were surgical: "I need to flag a serious credentialing concern. This new nurse on the cardiac unit, Cooper, she's exhibiting an obsessive pattern with one specific patient. Excessive familiarity. Inappropriate clinical interventions. And here's what troubles me: her background check shows military service, but the timeline doesn't align. There are gaps. Significant gaps. I'm concerned about the authenticity of her nursing credentials, frankly. I think we need a formal external review before this becomes a liability issue." He paused, letting silence work for him. Caldwell understood institutional power the way a conductor understands an orchestra. Every instrument had a frequency, and he knew exactly which notes to play. "I'm not making accusations. I'm a physician. But patient safety has to come first." The board president asked 3 questions. Caldwell answered each with precision, never quite saying anything that could be quoted back to him, but painting a picture of a nurse whose background didn't quite add up, whose judgment was questionable, whose presence posed a risk. By the time the call ended, it wasn't a request anymore. It was a chain reaction. By 9 a.m., Ashley's phone buzzed with an unknown number. The voice on the other end belonged to a woman named Sarah Chen, credentials verification specialist at Georgia Medical Systems Verification Company. Her tone was professional but probing. "Ms. Cooper, I'm calling to verify your employment history as part of a credentialing review. I have some questions about the gaps between your listed positions. You show Navy service from 2008 to 2026, but then your nursing licensure doesn't appear until 2024. Can you walk me through that timeline?" Ashley's jaw tightened. Just a breath. Nothing visible. She explained the transition period, the additional certifications. Sarah's next question came faster: "And the nature of your military service?" "The form lists it as classified." "That's unusual for civilian nursing credentialing." Ashley kept her voice level, the deferential tone she'd perfected for this cover. "Classified status. Medical field. I'm not able to elaborate beyond that. It's part of the discharge agreement." She heard Sarah making notes, the sound carrying a weight that shouldn't be there. Sarah continued, her questions becoming more pointed with each answer. Had Ashley ever been involved in investigations? Had she ever acted outside the scope of her nursing license? Had she received any special combat medical training? Each question had Caldwell's fingerprints all over it. He hadn't just filed a complaint. He'd called ahead, seeded doubts, primed the system to look for problems in the gaps where her real identity lived. The call ended with Sarah saying they'd need to contact the Pentagon directly for verification, which meant a formal request, which meant a paper trail, which meant questions at levels that could unravel everything. Ashley sat in the break room afterward, her hand steady as they wrapped around a cold coffee mug, but her mind was running calculations. The Pentagon's response time to credentialing inquiries was typically 72 hours. Commander Rains had maybe that long before the cardiac compromise became critical. And if her cover got pulled before she could stabilize him, if the investigation exposed her real identity before she'd completed the mission protocol, then everything, the sacrifice, the 2 years embedded in civilian medicine, the authorization to leave active duty to monitor a threat that came out of Baghdad, would collapse. At 10:15 a.m., the head of nursing, Diane Markham, found her restocking the supply cart in the hallway. Diane's face carried the weight of someone delivering bad news she didn't want to deliver. "Can we talk?" "Private." They moved to the nurse's station office, and Diane closed the door. Her voice was careful, measured. "Dr. Caldwell has formally requested that the Georgia Board of Nursing conduct a scope of practice audit on your clinical competencies. He's also requested we restrict your patient assignments pending the review. Starting today." Ashley didn't move. Didn't react. Diane continued, her discomfort visible in a way she wouldn't quite meet Ashley's eyes. "I pushed back, but he went to administration. They're pulling you from the ICU. You'll be reassigned to surgical recovery on the 4th floor." The implication landed like a defibrillator shock. Surgical recovery. Away from the ICU. Away from Commander Rains. Away from any position where she could monitor what was happening to him. "Diane," Ashley said, her voice dropping an octave, "that patient is about to go into acute cardiac distress. His tamponade isn't showing on standard monitoring. He needs continuous telemetry and someone who understands the presentation." Diane looked uncomfortable. "I believe you. But Caldwell has 20 years of history here. The board trusts him. And right now, your background is," she hesitated, "complicated. I'm sorry." By afternoon, the administrative decision had been officially documented. Ashley was removed from the cardiac unit's assignment rotation. Commander Rains's care was reassigned to Jennifer Morse, a competent nurse but one who didn't know what to look for in a tamponade patient deteriorating quietly, asymptomatically, until sudden catastrophic decompensation. The command structure of a hospital worked exactly like the command structure of a military unit. Information flowed through established channels, and a nurse without seniority or institutional capital couldn't fight it. Caldwell had weaponized that structure perfectly. At 4:30 p.m., Ashley attempted to escalate through the system. She filed a formal patient safety concern through the hospital's incident reporting platform, documenting her clinical observations about Commander Rains's subtle cardiac compensation patterns and the risk of missing decompensation if continuous monitoring was removed. The form was submitted electronically. She received a timestamp confirmation. By 6 p.m., she'd heard nothing back. The chief medical officer's assistant had sent an email, "Dr. Harrison is unavailable for meetings this week. Your concern has been flagged for his review." But that wasn't the worst part. At 6:45 p.m., Caldwell found her at the nursing station on the 4th floor, where she'd been reassigned to post-operative recovery. The surgical floor was quieter, dimmer, insulated from the urgent rhythm of critical care. He approached with the easy confidence of a man who'd already won, his white coat still pressed, his hair still perfect. Other nurses watched but pretended not to. Caldwell lowered his voice just enough that only Ashley could hear, though his body language was visible to everyone. "Your obsession with the previous patient is noted in your file. Clinically inappropriate attachment to a single case. Frankly, it suggests poor judgment about professional boundaries." He paused, letting that hang. "The investigation will likely explore whether your background in military medicine has blurred your understanding of civilian hospital protocols. I'd advise cooperation." Then he turned and walked away, leaving Ashley standing alone in fluorescent light that hummed like insects, his words sitting in her chest like a second heartbeat. She didn't respond. Didn't follow him. didn't raise her voice or defend herself. Her composure held because her composure had been forged in places where the cost of breaking was measured in lives. But internally, she was running scenarios. Caldwell had successfully isolated his target. He'd moved her away from the patient. He'd poisoned her credibility with the institution. He'd triggered an external investigation that would pull at the threads of her cover until everything unraveled. And he'd done it in 24 hours, moving with the precision of someone who understood that institutional machinery could destroy you if you let it. At 8 p.m., after her shift ended, Ashley sat in her car in the Cedar Creek Medical parking lot. Rain had started falling, a Savannah rain that came in waves, drumming against the windows like Morse code. Her encrypted phone vibrated once. The message came through encrypted channels, routed through Pentagon servers, status on target. Report now. She typed back, lost access to patient. Investigation initiated. Recommend extraction timeline. The response took 90 seconds, which meant it had gone up the chain. Mission critical. Target remains unstable. Maintain cover. Find workaround. Authorization pending. But authorization wasn't the problem. The problem was that she'd been visible. She'd cared too much. She'd let Caldwell see something real beneath the nursing cover, and now the machine was grinding toward answers it shouldn't find. The ICU monitors could be accessed from any terminal in the hospital system. Not officially, not according to protocol, but the access existed. Ashley knew the backdoor credentials. Every registered nurse had emergency access codes for situations where direct patient care required real-time vital sign monitoring. Using them now, off-duty, for a patient she was no longer assigned to, would create a digital trail. But Commander Raines's cardiac rhythm was showing the exact pattern she'd documented: subtle compensatory mechanisms, early signs of pericardial effusion, a slow decompensation that would become catastrophic between 11 p.m. and 3 a.m. if nobody was watching for it. She drove to the highway rest stop 7 miles from the hospital, pulled into the dark corner of the parking lot, and activated her personal laptop. The hospital's wireless network extended this far. She'd verified it weeks ago when she was planning contingency routes. Using the backdoor credentials, she logged into the hospital's ICU monitoring system. Commander Raines's vital signs appeared on her screen: heart rate 94, blood pressure 118/71, O2 saturation 96%. Normal readings. Deceptively normal. But the rhythm strip showed the early compensation pattern, the subtle elevation in central venous pressure that manifested as a flattening of the normal diastolic dip. In 4 to 6 hours, his body wouldn't be able to compensate anymore. A truck pulled into the rest stop, its headlights sweeping across her vehicle. Ashley minimized the screen immediately, muscle memory from ops where visibility meant death. The truck parked 2 spaces down. She waited until the driver went inside the rest stop building, then reopened the monitoring window. She had maybe 5 minutes before she needed to drive away. She took screenshots of his cardiac rhythm, documented the subtle signs of tamponade, and sent them through encrypted email to her Pentagon contact with a single line: tamponade imminent. Estimate 8-hour window. Patient isolated from competent care. Caldwell deliberately restricted access. Recommend immediate intervention authorization. The response came in 37 seconds, authorization pending. Stay dark. Do not engage patient directly. Investigation proceeding. Ashley sat in the dark car as rain hammered the windshield, her hands resting on the steering wheel, steady as they'd always been. The combat boots were still in her locker at Cedar Creek Medical, the ones that had walked through the streets of Fallujah, that had carried her through midnight raids in Ramadi, that she'd kept hidden for 2 years under scrubs and civilian clothes. She'd always known there would be a moment when the cover became thin enough to see through. She hadn't expected it to come this fast. She hadn't expected the threat to come from inside the institution, dressed in a white coat and armed with nothing more than institutional power and the assumption that a nurse with gaps in her employment history was someone worth destroying rather than someone worth fearing. The truck driver emerged from the rest stop, got back in his vehicle, and drove away. Ashley closed her laptop. She had a 9-hour window to prevent cardiac tamponade from killing a Navy SEAL commander while maintaining operational security, satisfying a hospital investigation, and not revealing to anyone, including the Pentagon, that she was already seeing exactly where this was all heading. She started the engine and drove back toward Cedar Creek Medical, toward the ICU she'd been removed from, toward the patient she couldn't save if she was caught, but couldn't abandon if she wasn't. The code alarm sounded at 2:56 a.m. from room for 12. 3 short bursts. Then the overhead, code blue, ICU, room for 12. Repeat, code blue, ICU, room for 12. Ashley was 3 floors down in surgical recovery, restocking the crash cart, when her hands went still. She knew that room number. She knew that patient. She knew exactly what was happening. Commander Rains. Cardiac tamponade. The complication she'd predicted 72 hours ago when Caldwell dismissed her warning as hysteria. She moved. Stairs. 2 at a time, taking them like a woman who'd run uphill through Fallujah carrying a bleeding Marine on her shoulders. The stairwell door burst open on the 4th floor and she was moving before her eyes adjusted to the fluorescent lights, before the night resident, some 3rd year named Chen, 26 years old and sweating, even registered her presence in the ICU. Rains's blood pressure read 68/40. Dropping. His oxygen sat 79% and falling like a stone. What do we have? Ashley moved to the bedside with the calm of someone who'd done this in a firefight. Chen's voice cracked, acute tamponade. I called the attending. He's 15 minutes out. I was about to start fluids and... No fluids. Ashley was already moving. His pressure's already bottoming. We need to release the fluid compressing his heart, not add more volume. Through the glass wall, the night shift watched. For nurses, a respiratory therapist, the charge nurse frozen in the doorway with her phone halfway to her ear. They watched a reassigned floor nurse, a woman Caldwell had publicly questioned, removed from ICU care, investigated for exceeding her scope, move through the pericardiocentesis kit with the precision of muscle memory older than her nursing license. 14-gauge needle. Chlorhexidine swab. Her hands didn't shake. Hands that had held lives together in Baghdad, in Ramadi, in a dozen operations where hesitation meant the person on the stretcher didn't walk off the landing zone. She positioned Rains on his left side. Counted the ribs. 4th intercostal space, just below the left costal margin. Pain is information, her old trauma surgeon had taught her in a tent hospital outside Fallujah. These hands learned that lesson in blood. The needle went in. Clean. First attempt. Okay, Commander. You're going to feel some pressure. Her voice was the same voice she'd used training combat medics, calm as a surgical laser. I'm going to draw off the fluid that's compressing your heart. Just breathe. The hiss of air escaping. Immediate. Pressure releasing like a valve opening. Blood. Dark venous blood from the pericardial sac. 50 cc. 100. She drew steady, watching Rains's blood pressure respond, 70. 75, 82. 90. 100 and something stabilizing toward normal while Chen's eyes went wide and the charge nurse's hand found the wall to steady herself. 200 cc perfect. Rains's oxygen sat climbing. His rhythm holding. His pressure stable. That's good, Ashley said to the needle, to the catheter, to the patient who'd been dying 2 minutes ago. That's good. She secured the line with tape, stepped back, and nodded to Chen. Call your attending. Tell him the acute tamponade has been decompressed. Commander's stable. Let's get a stat chest x-ray and get him on continuous monitoring until cardiothoracic can evaluate. Chen moved to the phone like someone waking up from a dream. Ashley was already pulling off gloves. The entire night shift was still watching through the glass. Some of them had tears on their faces, some had their hands over their mouths. She didn't flinch. She didn't acknowledge them. She'd learned that lesson in uniform, don't look back until the mission is done. By 6 a.m., Dr. Caldwell was in the ICU. Caldwell, in his tailored slacks and his golf shirt, face already red as a warning light, demanding answers from Chen about why an unauthorized nurse was on the unit, why a procedure was performed without physician oversight, why security hadn't been called the moment she appeared. By 8 a.m., Ashley was sitting in the hospital administrator's office on the third floor while Caldwell presented his findings with the confidence of a man who'd never been questioned in his life. Risk management director on his left. Hospital attorney on his right. Caldwell's voice dripping with the authority of someone who'd weaponized every institutional tool available to him. She performed an invasive procedure without physician order, Caldwell said. She practiced medicine. She violated her reassignment. And frankly, her knowledge of advanced cardiac interventions is suspicious given her credentials. Where exactly did she train? The administrator, Dr. Patricia Hayes, looked at Ashley. Ms. Cooper, can you explain your actions? Ashley's jaw moved once. Muscle memory. She kept her hands flat on the table, palms down, steady as steel. Commander Rains was in acute tamponade. His heart was being compressed by fluid. He was going to die in the time it took to wait for a physician. I performed a pericardiocentesis using a 14-gauge needle at the fourth intercostal space. 200 cc of blood. Pressure stabilized. Oxygen sat improved. He's alive. That's not your decision to make, Caldwell said. His voice had that edge of something wounded. A predator that had felt teeth for the first time. You exceeded your scope. You practiced medicine without a license. He was dying, Ashley said. That's for physicians to determine, not nurses who. Physicians aren't here at 2:06 a.m. when the monitor alarms. Ashley's eyes met his for exactly 1 second. I was. The administrator's pen tapped against her notepad. Risk management looked uncomfortable. The attorney was already taking notes. Ms. Cooper, I appreciate your concern for the patient. But Dr. Caldwell's point is valid. We have protocols. We have scope of practice. If every nurse decided to perform procedures when they felt the situation warranted it, we'd have chaos. If every nurse had the training to save lives when physicians weren't available, Ashley said quietly, patients like Commander Rains would survive more often. She'd made a mistake. Said too much. Let something show that shouldn't be showing. Caldwell heard it. His eyes narrowed like a shark sensing blood in the water. That's exactly what concerns me, he said, and he turned to the administrator. I recommend we place her on immediate suspension pending a full investigation. And I've already contacted the Georgia Board of Nursing with concerns about gaps in her background. A nurse doesn't possess this level of expertise without specialized military training. Which, if she has it, raises questions about disclosure, about why certain experience was omitted from her application. The room went so quiet you could hear the rain outside. Warm Georgia rain in April, hammering the windows like applause for a funeral. By 10 a.m., security was walking Ashley out of Cedar Creek Medical. Her badge confiscated at the front desk in front of day shift staff, she could feel their eyes, the charge nurse from surgical recovery, the respiratory therapist who'd watched her save a life 8 hours earlier, all of them watching her walk out like a criminal. The worn combat boot stayed in her locker. Protocol. She wasn't allowed to retrieve personal items during a suspension investigation. She sat in her car in the parking lot for 17 minutes before she could make the call. Her Pentagon contact picked up on the second ring. I'm listening, Colonel James said. I broke cover, Ashley said. The protocol deviation is documented. Hospital investigation is active. They're going to start asking questions about military training that don't have civilian answers. My clearance is compromised. Silence. The kind of silence that happens when plans collapse in real time. Where's the asset? Stable. For now. But I was removed from monitoring. Caldwell will make sure I don't get back in that hospital. Rains needs to be extracted, Colonel James said. We're moving up the timeline. Discharge in 72 hours. Medical transport to a facility where we can maintain operational security. You're being pulled out, Master Chief. You held the line as long as you could. He was right. She'd held the line. She'd kept Commander Rains alive long enough for extraction. She'd protected his security even as her own cover burned away like paper in a blowtorch. But that wasn't the worst part. She didn't have clearance to protect him anymore. Someone else would. Someone without the medical background, the field experience, the 23 years of knowing exactly what can kill you and exactly how long you have to stop it. At 3 a.m., Miller's Diner on Route 17 was empty except for 2 truckers at the counter and an old man with a newspaper. Ashley sat in a booth with coffee that had gone cold 3 hours ago, staring at her reflection in the black window. The parking lot behind it was empty. The rain had stopped. The night was the kind of dark that happens when everything's been taken away and you're waiting to remember who you are beneath the uniforms. That was when her phone buzzed. Text from Marcus. Mom, I know where your medals are. The words hit her like a percussion round. Not possible. Impossible. The shadow box was locked in her apartment, hidden in a closet she'd forbidden him to open, secured the way she secured everything, in layers, in compartments, in the architecture of a life built on the foundation of never being found. She didn't text back. She started the engine and drove toward home, toward her son, toward whatever was about to walk through her apartment door and change the shape of everything remaining. The headlights cut through the dark. The engine hummed. And somewhere in Cedar Creek Medical, Commander Rains slept in his hospital bed, alive, stable, unaware that his security blanket had just been ripped away, and that everything Ashley had sacrificed to protect him was about to collide with everything she'd sacrificed to keep hidden. What she didn't know was that her son had already made his decision. That Marcus was already driving to Cedar Creek with the shadow box on his passenger seat, with the Navy Cross glinting under the dashboard lights, with a 16-year-old certainty that the people who'd fired his mother had no idea who they were standing next to. That the entire architecture of Dr. Caldwell's authority was about to come down in the time it took for a boy to walk into a conference room. The conference room at Cedar Creek Medical went dead silent when the 2-star general from Fort Stewart opened the medication inventory ledger. His name was General Patricia Halloway, and she'd arrived to audit Ashley Cooper's credentials. That's what the hospital board thought, anyway. That's what Dr. Caldwell thought when he'd triggered the external investigation, confident his connections and his narrative would bury Ashley under layers of institutional skepticism. But General Halloway wasn't there to examine a nurse. She was there because the Pentagon didn't send 2-star generals to verify credentials. She was there because Commander Rains had whispered something classified into a secure phone line while still intubated, something about pharmaceutical diversion and a pattern that touched Cedar Creek's supply chain. The general's eyes moved down the page, then back up, then down again. She looked at the hospital administrator. Dr. Richard Caldwell's face had gone the color of old newsprint. 56 units of fentanyl signed out under a patient name. That patient had received 0 scheduled opioid doses. 32 vials of rocuronium, a paralyzing agent, documented for a procedure that never happened. The discrepancies didn't scatter randomly across Caldwell's tenure, they clustered. Specific batches. Specific patient codes. The pharmacy director started talking, her voice shaking, explaining that she'd flagged these inconsistencies to Dr. Caldwell 6 months ago. He told her the documentation was a clerical oversight, a training issue with the new nurses, nothing to escalate. The general made a note. The hospital's chief counsel, a woman named Margaret Sterling with grey eyes and a mouth drawn tight, started making phone calls. One of them was to the FBI field office in Atlanta. Another was to the DEA. A third was to the Georgia Medical Board. The investigation pivoted like a ship changing course mid-ocean. What had started as an inquiry into whether Ashley Cooper had falsified her credentials became an excavation into whether Dr. Marcus Caldwell had been systematically diverting controlled substances. The pharmacy records yielded the first layer, medication signed out under patient names, quantities that didn't match documented treatments, a pattern suggesting someone with legitimate access to the locked cabinet was taking what they needed and creating a paper trail that looked almost legitimate, almost plausible, if you didn't look too closely. Almost looked like nurse error. Almost looked like documentation failure. The hospital's accounting department found the second layer within 48 hours. Caldwell's surgical cases, high-acuity patients requiring extended stays, requiring repeated interventions, requiring expensive medications, were documented with a precision that didn't match the surgical complexity of simpler cases. A routine appendectomy billed as a complicated intra-abdominal emergency. A straightforward fracture repair documented as requiring multiple revision surgeries. Insurance claims with up-coded procedure codes, inflated complexity modifiers, charges for medications administered to patients in other departments but documented to Caldwell's cases. The pattern was systematic. The pattern was deliberate. The pattern had funded a boat payment of $7,000 a month for the past 8 years. Then the referral agreements came loose. Caldwell sat on the pharmaceutical committee that selected suppliers for Cedar Creek's medication inventory. One particular supplier, a company called Meridian Pharmaceuticals, had been receiving 85% of the hospital's orders despite comparable pricing available from 3 competitors. That supplier had simultaneously hired Caldwell as a consulting physician at $40,000 per month, a consulting position that required no documentation of work performed, no deliverables, no meetings. The money moved into an account that funded his vacation property in the Florida Keys. The pattern looked like kickbacks. The pattern looked like bribery. The pattern looked like a network designed to move pharmaceutical supply contracts toward one vendor in exchange for personal enrichment disguised as professional consulting fees. The Georgia Medical Board suspended his license pending investigation. The hospital board held an emergency session that lasted until 2 in the morning. By sunrise, Dr. Marcus Caldwell was escorted from Cedar Creek Medical by hospital security, his access badge deactivated, his office sealed, his patient roster transferred to other physicians, his career compressed into administrative silence and 3 cardboard boxes. Ashley returned to Cedar Creek 1 week later with a letter of full reinstatement, an apology she didn't want, and back pay calculated to the day she'd been terminated. The nursing supervisor who handed her the letter couldn't meet her eyes. The hospital administrator wanted to schedule a private meeting to discuss what had happened, to address the institutional failure, to assure her that protocols were being revised to prevent future retaliation. Ashley said she'd think about it. She wore her scrubs that first shift back. She wore them without shame, without hesitation, without any trace of the timidity that had been a tactical necessity during her assignment. The combat boots remained in her locker, but everyone at Cedar Creek knew about them now. Everyone knew. The entire night shift had watched that boy, Marcus, her son, the one who'd walked into an executive conference room carrying a shadow box, stand in the hallway outside the ICU while a conscious Navy SEAL commander described carrying a wounded nurse through 11 miles of enemy territory. Nobody at Cedar Creek was going to forget what those boots meant. She found Commander Raines in the cardiac rehabilitation unit during afternoon PT, where he sat in a wheelchair running through resistance training with his physical therapist. His lungs were strong again. His heart was steady. His left shoulder still ached where the shrapnel had entered, but that was the kind of pain that faded to background noise after a few years. Marcus stood beside the commander's chair, both of them studying a laptop screen filled with SEAL candidate program documentation, with fitness standards, with the kind of commitment that only came to people who understood the cost of it. The commander looked up when Ashley walked in. He started to come to attention. Muscle memory from 24 years of military service didn't disappear just because you were in a wheelchair, but she shook her head once. He settled back. Marcus saw her and smiled in that uncomplicated way of teenagers who didn't yet understand how close they'd come to losing everything. "How was your shift?" Marcus asked. "Quiet," Ashley said. "I'm going on break." The words came out flat. That was humor in her voice now, the kind that only soldiers understood, the kind that lived in the space between crisis and aftermath. The nursing supervisor found her in the break room 10 minutes later, seeking permission to tell her story to the hospital's new hire class. They were creating a case study around institutional whistleblowing, around protecting staff who reported safety concerns, around the cost of hierarchies that punish dissent. Ashley said yes, then qualified it, not about me. About listening. Teach them to listen. The supervisor nodded, understanding that Ashley wasn't looking for recognition. She was looking for systemic change, for a culture where the next person, the next nurse or resident or technician, wouldn't have to hide their competence under a mask of deference. The hospital president personally approved her protocols for cardiac monitoring. The new procedures built in safeguards against medication diversion. The pharmacy staff got additional training in documentation verification. Cedar Creek became a teaching hospital for what not to do, which meant it became a teaching hospital for how to do it right. 2 years passed in the ordinary way that time passes, shifts and seasons, and the gradual healing of things that shouldn't have broken. The investigation into Caldwell's network reached places the hospital would never know about, classified places, places where the Pentagon's counterintelligence team moved pieces across a board invisible to civilians. Commander Raines recovered fully and took a posting to Fort Stewart, running SEAL selection training, mentoring candidates through the hell week that separated who belonged from who didn't. Marcus graduated high school early and reported to BUDSS in San Diego with his mother's former commanding officer writing his recommendation letter, which meant Marcus understood from the first day that he was being tested not just by the Navy but by his mother's legacy, by the weight of knowing exactly who she was and exactly what it meant. Ashley walked past a strip mall on Route 17 on a Tuesday in late September, heading back to Cedar Creek from a lunch break. The sun had that late afternoon sharpness that cut through Savannah's humidity, and the parking lot was mostly empty. That's when she saw the folding table under a faded insurance company banner. That's when she saw him. Dr. Marcus Caldwell sat behind a card table covered in brochures, his tie loose at the neck, his face carrying the particular desperation that comes from selling commission-based insurance to shoppers who didn't want to talk to him. He looked up as she passed, and for one moment his eyes registered something: recognition, rage, impotence, the full catalogue of emotions that came with understanding that his own weapons had destroyed him. His network had made him valuable to the traffickers who'd been running pharmaceutical diversions through Cedar Creek. His credibility had made him useful. His board connections had made him essential. But his utility had an expiration date measured in federal investigations, and once that date passed, the people he'd worked with simply cut him loose. No rescue. No intervention. Just the kind of abandonment that came when liability exceeded usefulness. Ashley didn't stop. She didn't acknowledge him. She didn't say anything or even pause. She kept walking toward her car the way someone walks past a piece of litter, the way someone walks past furniture someone else had left on the curb. She got in her car and drove back to Cedar Creek, where her patient was waiting. Where the work continued. Where the ones who have seen the worst often give the most, and some of them do it in scrubs and some of them do it in uniforms, but the boots, the worn combat boots in her locker that were no longer hidden, those stayed the same. Those remembered the cost. Those remembered 11 miles through enemy territory. Those remembered the difference between hiding what you are and finally becoming that person openly. The fluorescent lights hummed their familiar frequency as she pushed through the ICU doors, and somewhere in a secure facility, an investigation remained open, and somewhere in San Diego, her son was learning what his mother already knew, and somewhere in the institutional memory of Cedar Creek Medical, they were teaching the new class about the importance of listening. If you've ever been silenced by someone with more authority than compassion, subscribe and like, because stories like Ashley's remind us that the quiet ones often hold the most power. Comment below, have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your real value?